What happens when the only officer left to care is the one who's already lost hope himself? On the loneliest night of winter, an exhausted cop and his old German shepherd spot a woman and child stranded on the edge of town, two lives on the brink, frozen and nearly forgotten. What follows isn't a rescue. It's a battle for faith, waged not with words, but with the silent loyalty of a wounded dog and the patient kindness of a man who's nearly given up on people. Before the snow thaws, every heart in this broken family will face a choice: hide their scars or begin to heal. Night in the Upper Peninsula came quietly, snow swallowing every sound until the whole world seemed hushed and distant. Out beyond the last row of porch lights, Sam Whitaker's patrol car drifted along the empty two-lane road, its headlights the only living thing to challenge the darkness. Flakes gathered thick on the windshield, melting, then freezing again into shifting lace. Inside the car, the dashboard glowed a tired blue, casting shallow shadows across Sam's lined face. The heater blew tepid air, but cold had crept into Sam's bones a long time ago. Years before this particular winter, years before the town had become a place of quiet disappointments and empty gestures. He wore the same navy uniform he'd worn for nearly 2 decades, the fabric soft at the elbows, the edges of his badge dulled, the cap on the seat beside him a touch too big for the head that had grown narrower with age. The radio hummed, a voice reading out roads that needed plowing, but Sam barely listened. He knew them all by heart. Out here, every mile was mapped by memory and regret. Beside him in the passenger seat, Shadow, a German shepherd with a coat the color of snow just before dawn, streaked with deeper grays, watched the world with alert, quiet eyes. 7 winters had settled into the lines around his black muzzle. Once, Shadow had tracked missing children through forests, dug through rubble for survivors. But now he simply rode along, a silent partner with his own collection of wounds, an old scar across his right hip, a slight limp when he was tired, and a tendency to startle in his sleep. Sam sometimes wondered if the dog dreamed of the same kind of shadows. The town itself was shuttered tight against the storm. Houses leaned into the cold, their curtains drawn, driveways empty. In Sam's rearview mirror, the yellow glow of the last gas station faded into blue-black distance. The only sound was the thrum of tires over ice, and, now and then, the deep, steady breath of the dog beside him, a rhythm as familiar as his own. Tonight, Sam was not expecting trouble. The world did not seem to want anything from him anymore. And in that quiet, he'd learned how to become invisible. A figure moving between streetlights, a presence in the background of other people's emergencies. There was a certain comfort in this, a numbness that protected as much as it isolated. He did his duty. He kept his distance. The town's aches were not his to mend, but there was something different about the air tonight. The cold was sharper, biting through the seams of his coat, and every few minutes, a gust of wind would whistle around the car, rattling the windows like a warning from somewhere long ago. Shadow shifted, his ears flicking toward the glass, but otherwise stayed still, his eyes never leaving the white tunnel of light ahead. As the car crested a rise outside the neighborhood called Huron Pines, Sam slowed, his gaze drifting from the road to the spaces between. Most nights, the snow covered everything, made every hurt and hunger look the same. But some nights, tonight perhaps, Sam found himself searching for something he did not have a name for. Maybe a sign, maybe just a reason to stop. He passed a stand of birch trees where the wind had sculpted drifts high against their pale trunks. The world outside was nothing but white and shadow, until for a second, the patrol car's headlights caught something dark at the edge of the road. At first, it was just a shape, too small for a deer, too low for a mailbox. Hunched in the snowbank, where the plows had left behind a wall of frozen slush. Sam's foot eased off the gas. The car coasted to a halt. In the silent pause that followed, Shadow lifted his head, ears forward, body tense. He let out a quiet, almost inaudible sound, a breath that might have been a whimper, or simply the dog's way of asking for permission to pay attention. Sam sat very still, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart beating in the dull, slow way it did when the past was close. For a moment, nothing moved. The wind battered the car, filling the night with its own kind of voice. Then, in the blue wash of headlights, Sam saw it, a woman, barely more than a silhouette, crouched beside a child in a red coat. The child's head was tucked against the woman's shoulder, and the woman's arms curved around the little body as if she could keep the cold, and everything else, at bay by sheer will. Snow was falling in heavy curtains now, covering them, blurring the boundaries between human, earth, and sky. Sam's breath fogged the glass as he watched. Something in the woman's posture, a bend in her spine, the hunch of her shoulders, was too familiar to look away from. The kind of brokenness that doesn't ask for help anymore, because it has learned what the world will offer. Shadow whined again, his nose pressed to the window, tail stiff, waiting for Sam's word. Sam reached for his flashlight, the gesture slow, measured. He could feel his heart knocking, the echo of old instincts urging him to be careful, to keep his own wounds hidden. But the line between memory and present was thin in the winter dark, and some part of him, some tired, half-forgotten hope, made him open the door. The night met him like a slap. Snow stung his cheeks, the air was sharp, and for an instant Sam felt every one of his years. He called Shadow softly, and together, man and dog stepped into the cold, toward the two figures hunched in the drift, toward whatever the night would ask of them. Neither of them knew yet how much they needed to be needed. Snow poured down heavier now, blurring the world into pale bands of wind and light. As Sam stepped away from the patrol car, the beams behind him cast his shadow long across the drifts. Shadow trotted by his side, body lowered, his movement unhurried, each step chosen for quiet, not haste. Sam's boots crunched over the uneven ridge where plow and winter had left jagged ice. There was no sound but the wind and the faint scuff of paws beside him. The air felt thick with something old, fear perhaps, or the memory of fear. It was the sort of night where any stranger's approach might bring either salvation or a new kind of threat. Ahead, the woman didn't stir. She was bundled in a thin coat that seemed no match for the weather. Her hair pulled across her face by the damp, her head bowed against the storm. In the crook of her arms, the child in red shivered. The girl's small face was turned toward her mother's chest, nose and cheeks raw with cold, eyes rimmed with a silent, exhausted pleading that Sam recognized in an instant. He had seen that look on faces in hospital corridors, at midnight accident scenes, and, more times than he'd admit, in his own mirror. He slowed as he neared them, stopping a few feet away. Shadow moved a half step ahead, his body angled between Sam and the pair, nose twitching, chest rising with a quickening breath. The dog didn't bark, didn't bare his teeth. Instead, he took the space with a kind of calm authority, a quiet that said, "I am here and nothing more." Sam didn't speak. Instead, he crouched in the snow, lowering himself until he was eye level with the girl. The child blinked, uncertain, her hands clutching tightly at the woman's sleeve. For a heartbeat, everything hung suspended. The cold, the fear, the uncertainty about what strangers might do when the world had already turned so hard. Shadow stretched his neck forward, pausing at the very edge of reach. He sniffed the air, not in suspicion, but in gentle inquiry. His ears flicked back, then forward, tail held low and steady. The girl's eyes met his. For a moment, there was only the exchange of breath between them, white clouds rising and vanishing. Shadow inched closer, then, very softly, nudged his nose against her knuckles, a single careful touch. She didn't flinch. Sam's gloved hand moved slowly, palm open, signaling that he meant no harm. He let his flashlight hang at his side, refusing to shine it directly in their faces. The wind lashed against his back, making his shoulders ache. Still, he waited, patient as the dog, for some sign that his presence was permitted. Finally, the girl turned her face up. Beneath the layers of grime and cold, her features were sharp with worry, and older than her years. She opened her lips, but no words came. Instead, her eyes flicked from Sam to Shadow and back again, searching, measuring. It was then that Sam saw the dark stain on the woman's coat, a bloom of blood seeping from beneath her arm, melting the snow where it dripped. The woman's breaths came thin and shallow, her head lolling against the child's shoulder. Sam's instincts sharpened. Old routines surfaced. Still, he didn't rush. He knew that fear, especially the kind carried by those who have been hurt too often, could turn even a rescue into another kind of wound. He reached into his coat for a clean handkerchief, holding it up for the girl to see before speaking, his voice low and even. "She's hurt. I'd like to help." The words weren't a question. They were an offering laid softly on the snow. The child nodded once, stiffly, tears already frozen along her cheeks. As Sam leaned in, Shadow stayed at the girl's side, his body a barrier, a comfort, a witness. The air was thick with the wild hush of falling snow as Sam slipped his arms beneath the woman's body, feeling the unnatural heat of fever beneath the cold. She was light, too light, her frame gone slack with exhaustion. The girl followed as Sam rose, her small hand resting on Shadow's back for balance, moving as if she'd learned already not to trust her own footing. Back at the car, the warmth of the interior felt almost violent, a sudden rush that brought color to faces and stung at raw skin. Sam settled the woman gently across the back seat, covering her with his own patrol jacket. The girl hesitated by the door, fingers still twisted in Shadow's fur, until the dog jumped up beside her, taking the spot at her feet, as though it had always belonged to him. Sam drove slow, hazard lights blinking through the storm, every turn familiar and yet somehow new. He watched them in the rearview mirror. The child curled up, the woman's breath shallow and rapid. Shadow curled in the space between, eyes never leaving the girl. He said nothing. There was no need. His presence, the warmth of the car, the dog's steady companionship, these were the only promises he could make tonight. The cabin came into view at last, its windows throwing gold rectangles onto the snow. Sam killed the engine, stepped out, and opened the back door. He lifted the woman easily, careful not to jar her wound. The girl slid out after, feet crunching in the snow, Shadow at her side. They crossed the threshold together, bringing with them the storm, the silence, and the very first, smallest thread of hope. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood, and the world outside faded to a muffled hush. Sam laid the woman on the old couch, covered her with blankets. The girl hovered nearby, silent, watching every movement, measuring each gesture for threat or kindness. Shadow lay at her feet, chest pressed to the worn rug, ears pricked forward, as if to say, "You are not alone here." And for the first time in many days, in a stranger's house, on a night when the wind howled through the pines, the child believed it might be true. The door latched shut behind them with a gentle click, sealing out the world of drifting snow and rumor. Inside, the air was heavy with the warmth of a fire already burning low in the iron stove. The orange light flickered along the floorboards, painting quiet shapes on the walls, dancing in the hollows of Sam's small, lived-in home. He worked with deliberate care, removing his boots by the door, hanging up his coat, shaking the ice from his cap. The woman, Claire, he remembered now, the name passed in town with that certain hush reserved for newcomers, lay still as sleep on the worn sofa. Her face was waxen and drawn, dark hair stuck in damp strings to her forehead. The child, Emily, hovered at her side, silent, tiny fists rubbing at her eyes, her shoulders so tense they might never relax again. Shadow, sensing some invisible boundary, circled the sofa and settled at the girl's feet, lying down so his body touched hers, his head angled just enough to watch her expression. He did not seek attention. He simply became a presence, a soft patch of breathing warmth that drew the child's small hand to rest atop his back. The room filled with a quiet that was not absence, but a trembling kind of peace. Sam crossed to the kitchen, filling a pot with water and setting it over the blue gas flame. He worked in silence, listening to the sound of the kettle warming, the fire's intermittent sigh, the faint whistle of wind at the windowsill. He gathered a stack of towels and the old tin first aid box, everything in its place, rituals of order, not so much for efficiency as for comfort. He returned to the sofa and knelt, his hands steady, movements careful not to startle. He unbuttoned the torn coat Claire wore, peeling it back from her side to reveal a slow, oozing cut high along her ribs, painful but not deep. His breath caught for a moment. The sight of blood never lost its power, no matter how many winters or tragedies a person might survive. He pressed a warm, damp cloth to the wound, drawing out the chill, then wrapped it tight with clean gauze and tape. Claire's eyes fluttered, a faint moan slipping from cracked lips. Emily leaned forward, close enough for Sam to smell the cold in her hair and the leftover terror in her skin. It was then, between Sam's measured breaths and Shadow's patient gaze, that a small, nearly soundless plea broke the room's hush. "Mommy, please don't die." It was barely a whisper, not a demand, not even a hope, the kind of phrase uttered only when the world has shrunk to its narrowest circumference. A mother's breath, a child's fear, a stranger's hands tending wounds. The words did not echo. They simply vanished into the stillness, as if the walls themselves had absorbed them out of mercy. Sam did not speak. He had no answers. He tucked a blanket around Claire's trembling shoulders, and another around Emily, so that the child sat between her mother and the warm press of Shadow's fur. The girl's eyes, huge, uncertain, glassy with fatigue, blinked up at Sam for a long, silent moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust the shape of his face, the meaning of his presence. Shadow shifted minutely, just enough to brush his nose against the child's knee, a feather-light touch, reassurance without language. Emily's fingers burrowed deeper into the thick ruff of the dog's neck. Sam watched the scene, a knot rising in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, a longing not to rescue, not to fix, but simply to witness. to keep company in the dark. He brewed weak tea, pouring it into a chipped mug, setting it near the sofa. He let the fire burn down to embers, the room quiet except for the small, almost imperceptible sounds. The click of Shadow's claws as he shifted his weight, the steady hum of the kettle, Claire's shallow breathing, the ticking of the clock. Nothing demanded conversation. The language of care here was measured in gestures, in blankets tucked, wounds bandaged, hot water drawn, a dog's patient watch. For a time, the world outside might have ceased to exist. Snow built up at the windowsills. The branches of the pine outside sagged under their white burden. Sam moved through the little house on instinct, adjusting the fire, washing his hands, checking the first aid box. Actions as practiced as prayer. Habits grown from years of quiet survival. As midnight wore on, Emily's head drifted down to Shadow's flank. Her breathing slowed. Sam looked over at Claire, noting the faintest flush returning to her cheeks. For the first time since entering the house, some color fought its way back into her skin. She seemed both impossibly young and terribly old in that light, marked by losses she had carried too far, for too long. Shadow's ears flicked at every shift in the room, but he did not move. Sam knelt once more at the girl's side, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face with the back of his hand. Her brow twitched in sleep, but she did not wake. There, in the fragile quiet, Sam felt something loosen inside him. He thought of his own wife, years gone now, how in her final days she had drifted in and out of pain, and how there had been nothing to do but remain present, to let her know she wasn't alone. Tonight, he offered that same gift to strangers. Not rescue, not repair, but shelter and witness. He stoked the fire, dimmed the lamp, and sat in his old chair, listening to the breathing of a child, a mother, and a loyal dog, all wounded in different ways, all clinging to the promise that morning might come. Shadow lifted his head, eyes catching the last glow of the firelight. For one quiet moment, man and dog looked at one another. Two survivors, two witnesses, neither whole, neither expecting miracles, but neither willing to abandon their watch. And so, the night deepened, holding its silence around them. For the first time in a long time, none of them were entirely alone. The house held its hush long into the night. The only voices belonged to the old iron stove and the winter wind as it circled the eaves. Sam let the lamp burn low in the kitchen, the light golden and soft on the floor. He moved with practiced quiet, checking the woodpile by the hearth, filling the kettle once more, watching steam curl and vanish above the spout. Claire slept uneasily on the couch, her face half-shadowed, one hand curled loosely on her stomach where the bandage lay. The lines in her forehead had softened, just a little, as if warmth itself could mend things that pain had carved so deeply. Emily was a silent bundle nearby, swaddled in the thickest blanket Sam owned, a patchwork of old flannels, the colors faded by years of washing and sun. At the end of the couch, Shadow had curled himself into a crescent, his tail tucked over his hind legs, his chest rising and falling with the slow, patient rhythm of a dog who knows his only task is to remain. Sam busied himself in the kitchen not out of necessity, but out of the old instinct to keep hands moving when the mind could not rest. He washed his mug, dried it, set it carefully on the rack. He wiped the crumbs from the counter, laid out a clean cloth for the morning, and glanced every few moments toward the living room, half expecting, half hoping, for some sign that this night would pass without further unraveling. From time to time, Claire stirred, her breath catching as she moved, a soft sound like the turning of a page in the quiet room. Emily did not wake. She only shifted once, a hand reaching out in sleep to find Shadow's flank. The dog did not move, but seemed, even in rest, to sense her touch. The tip of his ear flicked, and a low, reassuring huff escaped him. In that small exchange, a child's hand, a dog's patient warmth, was the first glimmer of trust that needed no language at all. Sam lit another log in the stove. The smell of pine resin drifted through the room. He sat on the floor a moment, back resting against the side of his old armchair, and let his gaze travel between the three forms, woman, child, dog, braided together by circumstance and the barest thread of hope. He remembered his wife's last winter, the way she'd found comfort in the presence of their old spaniel, even when words and medicines failed. Some kinds of pain could only be kept at bay by proximity, by the promise, unspoken, that someone would not leave. A gust shook the window. Sam rose, moving to check the latch. Snow was stacking higher on the sills now, threatening to bury the porch. He remembered childhood storms, nights spent at his mother's side listening to the wind, waiting for his father's boots to crunch through the drifted walk. That same waiting lived in him now, a quiet readiness, a vow that no one, no matter how briefly in his care, would be left wanting warmth or watchfulness. He returned to the living room, crouched beside the sofa. He checked the bandage on Claire's ribs, careful not to wake her. Her pulse, when he touched her wrist, was slow but strong. He tucked the blanket closer to her neck, brushed a lock of hair away from her cheek. She flinched at the touch. Even in sleep, a reflex honed by too many years without safety. Emily, now half-curled into Shadow's side, let out a sigh. Sam watched the dog's eyes open for just a moment, glinting in the firelight, before they closed again. Trust manifest in the way he gave himself to rest in this unfamiliar place. The hours passed quietly, marked only by the shifting of the wood in the stove, the gentle tick of the old kitchen clock, the slow turn of night outside. Sam sat at the table and wrote a few lines in a notepad, numbers from his patrol, a note to check on a neighbor's broken porch rail, things that belonged to another life. Every few minutes he listened for changes in the room behind him. In the early blue hours before dawn, Claire woke, her brow furrowed in confusion, then fear, then slow recognition. She started to rise, but the pain drew her back with a gasp. Sam knelt beside her again, his presence steady and without demand. He handed her a cup of water, watched as she sipped, her hands trembling, her gaze flickering from him to Emily to Shadow and back. She did not thank him. She did not need to. The gratitude was in the way her shoulders eased, just a fraction, as she settled back into the nest of blankets. The gratitude was in the way Emily slept on, finally unworried, and the way Shadow's breathing calmed the air itself. Sam tended the stove once more, careful not to let the room grow too warm. He sat in his armchair, hands folded in his lap, eyes half closed but not asleep. He watched the light crawl slowly along the walls as the world outside shifted from black to silver, from storm to the promise of day. For a long, unhurried while, no one moved, no one spoke. They simply existed together, their separate wounds stitched close by shared proximity and the silent pact of those who have seen darkness and stayed. As dawn finally paled the window glass, Sam felt the weight of the night ease just enough to breathe again. He did not think of the stories that might be told about him, the questions that might come. He thought only of the quiet within these four walls, the hush that follows fear, the fragile peace earned by simply not turning away. And so, in the warm darkness, they waited for morning. For now, That was enough. Night settled heavy and deep around the cabin, a hush so complete it seemed to have a weight all its own. Wind pressed against the walls, rattling the glass in its frames. But inside, the old stove kept up a gentle battle, holding the darkness at bay with warmth and the faint scent of charred pine. Sam sat in the battered armchair by the window, his hands folded over his knees, his gaze drifting between the fire and the two sleeping forms on the couch. He had grown used to silence, but this kind of quiet was different. It wasn't the emptiness he had known. Nights spent alone, with only the dull ache in his leg and the slow tick of the clock for company. This quiet was fuller, crowded with presence, the soft, restless breaths of the child, the way the woman's brow creased and smoothed as she slipped in and out of uneasy dreams, the low, steady pulse of Shadow's breathing as the dog lay sentinel by the couch. Sam watched the flames rise and fall behind the stove's glass. Each flicker cast new shadows, drawing lines along the walls, etching old memories across his mind. He thought of winters past, of how the world could grow so cold and silent you might begin to believe nothing would ever change. He remembered his wife's last days, her fingers like bird bones in his, the hospital air so sterile it made him miss even the sharp tang of wood smoke and wet wool. There were scars, he knew, that did not show on skin. He saw them now in the way Claire's hand curled even in sleep, always guarding, always half-clenched against the world. He saw them in the slight tremor of Emily's lashes, the way the little girl flinched at the sudden crack of a log shifting in the stove. Sam felt the ache of his own wounds, too. The limp that tightened when the cold set in. The memories that surfaced with each turn of the night. Shadow, for his part, kept his vigil with a patience only dogs and the truly weary possess. From his place at the foot of the couch, he turned his head now and then, tracking sounds only he could hear, a sigh from Claire, the change in Emily's breathing as a dream caught her up, the subtle shifting of Sam's weight as the man's mind circled old griefs. In the darkness, Shadow's eyes gleamed softly, reflecting firelight, half shut but always alert. Sometimes Sam would rise and cross the room to check the bandage at Claire's side. He worked gently, mindful not to wake her. He felt the heat of fever receding, the wound knitting beneath his hands. Each movement was deliberate, economical, learned in the slow school of caretaking. Years spent tending to what was broken and never truly whole again. Afterward, he would draw the blanket higher over Claire's shoulders, letting his hand linger for a moment. Not out of sentiment, but solidarity. He thought of speaking. He thought of all the things he might say. That she was safe. That the storm would pass. That kindness could sometimes be a refuge for people who had forgotten how to ask. But words, he knew, were brittle things at the wrong hour. Instead, he moved about the house performing small acts of care, refilling the kettle, placing a glass of water within reach, adding a log to the fire. Emily, half awake, watched him through slitted eyes. Once, when Sam leaned over to tuck the edge of the blanket under her chin, she reached for his wrist, just for an instant, just to know he was real. Then her hand fell back, disappearing into the folds of Shadow's fur. The gesture said more than 1,000 reassurances. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen. Shadow lifted his head, nose twitching, ears pricked to the silence beyond the walls. Sam followed the dog's gaze to the frosted window, remembering nights in his youth when he'd watched for headlights that never came, for footsteps that never arrived. He knew the shape of hope as it withered and as it returned. He limped to the window and looked out. Snow still fell, relentless, swallowing the yard, burying old footprints. The world looked clean in the way that only winter can achieve. Everything covered, everything hidden. Yet inside, the cabin breathed with a different kind of clarity, one forged not by erasure, but by endurance. He returned to his chair, stretching his leg, the old ache flaring and then fading. He watched as Claire shifted again in her sleep, her lips moving with words meant only for dreams. Shadow rose and crossed the room to the window, placing himself between whatever ghosts lingered outside and the fragile peace within. Sam felt the dog's loyalty like a silent question. How many times had they both waited through the darkness, uncertain if morning would come? He did not know if wounds like theirs ever truly closed. He only knew that presence, his, the dog's, even that of a sleeping child, was a kind of promise, that no matter how many storms might come, they would not be left to weather them alone. In the deepest hour, Sam's thoughts grew slow and heavy, looping back over the night. The frightened eyes in the snow, the tremor in the child's voice, the thin thread of trust woven in a dog's quiet companionship. The scars he carried, visible and not, did not seem quite so heavy here in this room where fear and hope lay so close together. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the house breathe, to the girl's sigh, to the steady heart of a dog at his feet. Outside, the wind howled and died and howled again, but inside, the fire burned on. Morning would come, and with it, perhaps, the first faint light of healing. Dawn came quietly, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile stillness inside the cabin. Pale light crept over the snow-laden windows, painting everything with the faded silver of another Michigan winter morning. For a while, no one moved. Sam dozed in his chair, head resting back, the gentle ache in his leg softened by sleep. On the couch, Claire stirred before she woke, caught in that place between fear and hope. Shadow had risen before the rest, his silent form now stationed at the threshold, nose twitching at the scent of day. When Sam opened his eyes, the world was so quiet he almost believed it had been remade overnight. The old anxieties returned with the rhythm of his breath, memories of judgment, of choices that never pleased anyone for long. He rose stiffly, joints protesting, and crossed to the kitchen to fill the kettle. The floor was cold beneath his feet, but he took comfort in the simple tasks, setting out mugs, slicing bread, cracking eggs into a bowl. He moved with the careful grace of someone who understands that even the smallest noise can shatter a tenuous peace. Claire sat up, squinting at the window, unsure for a moment where she was. She pulled the blanket closer, eyes searching the room before settling on Emily, who still slept, her cheek pressed into the folds of Shadow's fur. For a long time, Claire said nothing. The morning air was heavy with what had not been said the night before. Emily woke next, blinking at the unfamiliar brightness. Her hair was tangled, but her face, though pale, was calm. She looked to Shadow first, and only when she saw him, steady as the rising sun, did she push herself up, rubbing at her eyes. Shadow stretched, tail sweeping the rug, his body arching in a long, slow bow. The child smiled for the first time since the night in the snow. Sam set plates on the table. He poured hot water, the steam curling upward. He watched Claire as she moved, slow, deliberate, one hand never straying far from her wounded side. She offered a soft, grateful nod, but no words. Emily took her place beside her mother, her legs swinging from the bench, eyes bright with the hopeful hunger of a new day. They ate in silence, interrupted only by the scrape of forks and the muted thump of Shadow's tail against the floor. Sam wondered if they would ever fill this room with conversation, or if the unspoken language they'd developed, gestures, glances, the shuffling of chairs, would always be enough. He found, to his surprise, that he didn't mind either way. When breakfast was done, Sam pulled on his uniform jacket and glanced at the clock. Duty was calling, even if the world outside felt impossibly far. Before he left, he checked Claire's bandage once more. His hands were gentle but efficient. He had learned from years of tending wounds, his own and those left behind by others. He told Claire she could rest here as long as she needed, the words quiet, almost a suggestion rather than a command. He reached for his hat, but just as he stepped toward the door, there was a sharp rap on the frame, a knuckle against old wood, brisk and businesslike. Sam tensed, a habit born of years spent waiting for bad news. Shadow moved between Sam and the door, ears alert, body low. The dog's steady presence was a reminder that safety, for some, was always conditional. On the other side stood a young officer in a crisp uniform, her cheeks red from the cold. She handed Sam a folded sheet of paper, official, impersonal, the sort of thing that changed the weather inside a house more quickly than any storm. "Captain wants to see you down at the station," she said, keeping her eyes on the porch. "There's talk, something about taking in people, protocol, just letting you know." Sam nodded, a slow acceptance. He read the paper after she left. Language couched in policy, questions about authority, implications that his care for Claire and Emily was somehow a breach, an overreach, a kindness that made people suspicious in a town grown wary of strangers. He stood at the window for a long time after the cruiser's taillights vanished into the snow. He watched Shadow nose at the glass, sensing Sam's unease, the change in the room's energy. Behind him, Claire tidied the dishes, her movements growing smaller, tighter, as if shrinking beneath the weight of what might come. Emily sat on the floor beside Shadow, tracing the pattern of his fur with slow, repetitive strokes, lost in the comfort of his living warmth. The world outside was the same, gray, frozen, indifferent. But within these four walls, everything had changed. The old, familiar loneliness had been replaced by a more complicated ache. The knowledge that every small act of caring could be misunderstood, every effort at safety scrutinized. Sam pulled on his boots and went out, promising to return. Shadow paced at the door, torn between his loyalty to Sam and his new responsibility to the two who remained inside. In the end, he pressed his head to Emily's shoulder, a gentle benediction, before settling back to his watch. At the station, Sam found the air sharper, the light less forgiving. Whispers followed him down the hall, colleagues who looked away, who weighed the risks of caring against the safety of rules. His captain, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, asked careful questions. "Did you know her before? Why take them in? Are you sure this is what's best? For you, for them?" Sam answered as best he could, steady, refusing to let regret show. He knew the risk was real, not just to himself, but to Claire and Emily, whose safety now depended on the thin line between kindness and suspicion. When he returned home, the air in the house was changed. Claire was quieter, Emily more withdrawn, Shadow more vigilant at the window. Sam set his badge on the table and sat in silence, feeling the weight of all the things he could not control: gossip, protocol, the slow, bruising work of trust. But as evening fell, Shadow crossed the room to Sam, pressing his head against the man's knee. It was enough. For tonight, Presence was their only certainty. And somewhere beyond the glass, the snow kept falling, covering everything in its mute, forgiving light. Hospital waiting rooms have a way of swallowing sound, softening voices and footsteps into a nervous hush. This morning, the chairs were half filled with people folded into winter coats, watching the hands of the clock as if their hope depended on it. The air was warm, but tinged with the antiseptic tang of old linoleum, and too many heartaches carried through the doors. Sam sat in a plastic chair with his cap in his lap, his uniform jacket zipped to the throat. He watched the sun move slowly along the scratched tile floor. Claire sat beside him, one hand clutching her side, the other gripping her daughter's small fingers. Emily, bundled in a faded blue coat, pressed close to Shadow, who lay stretched across their feet. Quiet, calm, a patch of living warmth on the coldest of mornings. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The room seemed suspended in a kind of gentle suspense. The whisper of nurses' shoes, the beep of a faraway monitor, the flicker of sunlight over the cheap magazine rack. When the nurse finally appeared, she nodded to Claire and beckoned them down the hall. Claire's steps were hesitant, every motion careful, but there was a determination to the set of her jaw. Sam watched her back as she walked, saw the way Emily hesitated for a moment, then moved after her, guided by the invisible tether that still connected them. Shadow and Sam waited in the corridor. The dog lay on the scuffed tile, head on paws, watching every passing stranger with that silent, attentive patience Sam had come to rely on. Sam rubbed a thumb along the rim of his cap, feeling the old, familiar worry rise, the knowledge that kindness, no matter how quietly offered, sometimes had a cost. Time passed the way it does in places like this, slow, circular, thick with memory. Sam found himself recalling his wife's last visit to this very building, the shape of her hand in his, the smell of lilies at the nurse's station, the soft, apologetic tone in the doctor's voice as she delivered news that changed nothing and everything all at once. He glanced down at Shadow, whose tail thumped quietly against the floor as Emily reappeared, clutching a worn piece of paper. Her face was pale but calm. Her mother's was lined with exhaustion but touched, for the first time, by relief. The doctor, an older man with a gentle voice and a tired smile, emerged behind them. He had known Sam for years, had seen him through loss and through service, had watched the slow, careful rebuilding that followed grief. He addressed Claire in a voice just above a whisper. "You'll be all right. Exhaustion, mostly. Time and rest will do more than medicine now." He looked down at Emily, then at Shadow, and offered a quiet nod. "We all need someone to watch over us sometimes, especially on the hardest days." Claire's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. She managed a thin, grateful smile. Emily pressed her face into Shadow's neck, her small arms wrapping around the dog's broad shoulders. Shadow accepted the embrace, head still, breathing deep and slow, a steady, grounding heartbeat for a child still learning that not all touch is something to fear. In the car, driving home through gray slush and narrow lanes, no one spoke. The world outside passed in a blur of wet glass and battered storefronts, a landscape both familiar and somehow changed. Sam's hands were careful on the wheel. Claire stared out at the snow, her profile tense, but there was a softness at the corners of her mouth, as if she was remembering the shape of hope. That afternoon, the house was filled with a fragile, watchful peace. Emily sat by the fireplace, coloring in a bent notebook Sam had found in a drawer. She drew dogs, brown and gray, with patient eyes and wagging tails, her tongue caught in concentration. Claire rested on the couch, bundled in blankets, drifting between sleep and wakefulness. Sam moved through the house quietly. He mended a broken cabinet hinge. He cleared ice from the porch. He made tea, left it steeping by Claire's elbow. There was no grand gesture, only the rhythm of small, ordinary acts, the kinds that knit wounded things back together. At dusk, a knock came at the door. It was Dr. Harris, the same man from the hospital, stopping by on his way home, cheeks pink from the cold. He carried a paper bag filled with medicine samples and a note scribbled with instructions. He lingered only a moment, giving Sam a look that was half warning, half blessing. "Rest," he said, "all of you. Let the world wait for a while." Night settled gently. Claire read to Emily from a tattered book, her voice low and even, her hand stroking the girl's hair as she drowsed. Sam sat in his armchair, boots off, letting the warmth seep into his bones. Shadow lay on the rug, eyes closed, tail flicking in his dreams. For a few quiet hours, the world outside seemed to recede. There was only the house, the soft click of the clock, the hush of fire and breath, the slow, steady rebuilding of trust. First in the dog's company, then in the small, careful kindnesses of a man who asked for nothing in return. And in that hush, the first glimmers of something like healing began to shine. Fragile, almost invisible, but there all the same. Winter stretched on, reluctant to loosen its hold. In the weeks that followed, the storm outside faded, replaced by another kind of chill, a subtle, persistent undercurrent that seeped through walls more easily than cold. Whispers wound their way through town, at the market, in the diner, around the post office's wood stove. People spoke in low voices about the officer who had taken in strangers, about the woman with the haunted eyes, about the little girl who rarely smiled except for the company of a dog. Claire felt it in the way the cashier's gaze slid away when she reached for bread, the briefest hesitation before change was dropped into her palm. She heard it in the careful pauses of neighbors who once might have offered help, now wary and a little too polite. Small towns, she was learning, could cradle or freeze a person, sometimes both at once. Sam noticed the difference too, though he'd grown used to being a solitary figure on the street. There were more questions now, more subtle shifts in the air when he entered a room, more glances exchanged behind his back at the station. Some people offered encouragement in private, an old friend with a squeeze of the arm, a nod from a nurse at the clinic, but most kept their distance. Sam didn't try to change their minds. He knew better than to spend his heart arguing with rumor. Inside the cabin, a different rhythm was settling in. Claire, finding her strength, began looking for work. She moved quietly through the house in the mornings, cleaning dishes, folding blankets, mending a loose button on Emily's coat. Every action was careful, as if afraid to leave too much of herself on the world. It was Sam who first mentioned the library's notice about needing part-time help, his words offered over breakfast, not as advice but as an invitation. Claire hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face, then accepted with a quiet nod. The following Monday, she started sweeping floors and shelving books, her presence so gentle some patrons barely noticed her. Emily returned to school, hand clutching the leash that tethered Shadow beside her on the morning walks down the snowy lane. At first, the other children were wary, watching the girl who hardly spoke, and the big gray dog at her side. But Shadow's calm was infectious, and soon, kids began offering shy pats, sharing mittens, inviting Emily to join in games during recess. Emily seldom spoke, but the softening in her shoulders, the ease with which she leaned into Shadow's fur, told its own story. Still, judgment lingered. Once, as Claire left the library late, two women from town stopped talking when she passed. Their voices picked up again as soon as her back was turned, soft, sharp, threaded with the sort of suspicion that clings to newness and to wounds. Claire kept her head down, her steps measured. At home, she smiled for Emily, listened to Sam's dry humor, learned to bake simple bread in the small oven. But there were days when the weight of other people's fear and curiosity made her bones ache. Sam bore his own share of warning. The department called him in more than once, each meeting polite but pointed. Protocols, his captain explained, aren't just rules. They're what keep things from getting messy. Sam listened, offered short, honest replies. When he returned home, he never mentioned the specifics, only letting the weariness settle into the slope of his shoulders as he set his badge on the mantel. Shadow would press against his knee in these moments, a silent buffer between Sam and whatever anxieties might have followed him home. Shadow was everywhere, at the door, watching Emily through the window, curled beneath the kitchen table as Claire read recipes or brushed out her daughter's hair. He became the house's steady pulse, a living constant. When the days were hard, Claire would find herself sitting on the back steps, hands buried in his fur, the weight of him against her knees anchoring her to the moment. Emily, still quiet at school, became more open at home, drawing pictures of dogs and people, always with a golden patch of sunlight somewhere on the page. Through it all, the household survived on small rituals. Sam brewed coffee each morning and left a mug by the library card catalog for Claire on his way to patrol. Claire left notes for Emily in her lunch, a heart, a smile, a simple, "I'm proud of you." In the evenings, they ate together at the old table, the silence companionable, broken now and then by the laughter of a child or the crackle of the wood stove. Sometimes after dinner, Sam would take Shadow out along the edge of the woods, walking in the soft dark, the snow now receding, bearing patches of brown grass and old leaves. They spoke little, letting the quiet fill the spaces between. On those walks, Sam would remember old hurts and find them less sharp. Shadow would pause, nose to the wind, before trotting ahead, always leading them home. Inside, life was still fragile. There were setbacks, nights when Claire woke from old nightmares, mornings when Emily clung too tightly to her mother, afternoons when Sam wondered if his kindness had only made things harder. But there was also an ease that was growing, almost imperceptible, like the thaw that comes at the end of a long winter. No one hurried this healing. No one demanded more than could be given. And so, while rumor and judgment battered the house from outside, within its walls there was a patience, a steady work of mending and acceptance. On the hardest days, this was all they could offer each other, a presence that did not flinch, a loyalty that did not need to be earned. And through every storm, Shadow kept his watch, ears pricked, body steady, a silent reassurance that, even here, even now, the world could be gentle again. It was March when the first day arrived with no snow on the ground. Sam noticed it the moment he stepped out onto the porch at dawn. The air was still sharp, his breath still fogged in front of him. But underfoot was only cold earth and patches of flattened grass where the drifts had finally surrendered. Overhead, the sky was the soft gray of a cotton sheet, and in the far branches, robins were calling, hesitant, as if testing the promise of spring. He paused on the porch, mug of coffee warming his palms, and listened. Beneath the calls of the birds and the distant rumble of a delivery truck, there was a different kind of quiet, a peaceful one. Not the silence of loss but the hush of something slowly being restored. Sam closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds soak into him, feeling the old ache in his leg, the familiar weight in his chest, loosen by just a fraction. Inside, the house woke gently. Claire moved through the kitchen, her steps softer now, no longer anxious as she prepared oatmeal on the stove. The soft click of spoon against pot, the whisper of water being poured, filled the space with a sense of morning ritual. She wore Sam's old flannel shirt over her clothes, sleeves rolled at the cuffs, and her hair, though still a little unruly, shone in the pale window light. When she glanced up and caught Sam's eye, she offered a half smile, small but real. Emily was already up, her small feet bare on the rug as she raced from her room, a battered sketchbook clutched in her arms. Her hair was wild, cheeks still pink from sleep. She went straight for the back door, flinging it wide to let Shadow out into the yard. The big dog bounded ahead, tail up, stopping at the first dry patch of grass to sniff the ground, ears flicked toward every sound. "Go on, Shadow," Emily called, her voice carrying further than it had in months. She chased after him, laughter bubbling out, light, bright, the kind of sound that seemed to shake loose something caught in all of them. Sam stood at the window, coffee forgotten, watching as Emily and Shadow circled each other on the damp ground. The child reached down to scoop up the last brown leaves left behind by the thaw, flinging them skyward as Shadow leapt after, paws scattering mud, fur catching the sun that broke, brief and golden, through the clouds. For a moment, it was just the three of them in the yard, everything else fading into the gentle clarity of morning. Claire leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, a quiet look of awe on her face. She watched Emily, watched Shadow, and then turned her gaze to Sam. No words were exchanged. They simply stood together, a silent acknowledgement that this ordinariness, this joy, was something neither of them had dared to hope for, even as winter's grip loosened. After breakfast, Sam pulled on his boots and set about repairs to the old roof. He moved slowly, favoring his leg, but there was a lightness to his work, the satisfaction of purpose. Each nail, each plank of wood, felt like an act of faith, not in the building itself, but in the life returning beneath it. Inside, Claire settled in a chair by the window, a library book open in her lap, the old flannel shirt wrapped close against the morning chill. Sometimes she would glance up and catch sight of Emily playing with Shadow, her fingers tracing words along the page, but her mind caught between worlds, the one she had come from, and the one she was building now. She had started to fill the house with her own small touches, a new dish towel, a faded photograph of Emily at the beach, a glass jar for wildflowers once the thaw truly came. The changes were slight, but they drew the space together, stitched it with threads of intention and care. By midday, the sun had climbed higher, the sky blue now, light streaming through the kitchen's streaked windows. Sam came down from the roof, stretching his back, breathing in the clean air. He found Claire at the table, Emily beside her with colored pencils, Shadow sprawled on the rug, head resting on the child's foot. For lunch, they shared sandwiches, cut unevenly, and slices of apple. No one hurried. Sam watched the way Emily handed the crusts to Shadow, who took them with careful delicacy, eyes shining. Claire caught Sam's gaze and they shared a smile, quick, private, the kind that settles deep and stays. In the afternoon, Sam fetched the battered radio from the closet, setting it on the windowsill. Music drifted out, filling the rooms with the gentle strum of guitars and the hum of old, familiar voices. Emily danced in the living room, spinning in circles, until she collapsed in a heap beside Shadow, giggling, breathless. The dog rolled onto his side, legs in the air, content to be her sun-warmed pillow. Claire read aloud from her book, the cadence of her voice soothing. Sam listened from the porch as he patched the last shingles, letting her words mingle with birdsong and the scrape of leaves. As dusk fell, they gathered at the kitchen table. Sam poured tea. Claire spooned honey. Emily fed Shadow bits of her biscuit beneath the table, thinking no one noticed. The lamp cast a warm circle of light, holding them together against the coming dark. For the first time, it felt like a home. Not just a shelter against the storm, but a place where wounds could breathe and laughter could return, and even the quietest souls might be coaxed back into the light. Outside, the night came soft and slow, but inside, every heartbeat just a little easier, held together by small acts, warm hands, and the presence of a faithful dog who needed no explanation, only to be near. Spring came late to the northern woods, arriving first as a faint lightning in the mornings, a kind of softness to the air that lingered even as frost clung to the shadowed hollows. On one of those rare afternoons, Sam took Shadow for a walk down the winding path that circled the lake behind the house. The trail was still muddy in places, stitched with the fresh green of wild grasses forcing their way up through last year's thatch. Sam moved at a slow pace, the limp in his left leg more noticeable on damp days, but it didn't matter. Shadow trotted at his side, never pulling ahead, his gait loose and easy, nose sometimes to the ground, sometimes lifted to catch the wind. It was quiet enough to hear water lapping gently at the shore, and the faint call of geese overhead. They paused at the bench by the water, the old wood silvered by time, the seat slightly crooked from years of freeze and thaw. Sam sat, exhaling slowly. He watched the ripples play across the lake, the sun shifting gold against the far bank. After a moment, Shadow hopped up beside him, planting himself with a sigh, his flank pressed against Sam's knee. There was no urgency to the moment, only the comfort of a body nearby, of breath and patience, and the unspoken understanding that, for now, this was enough. Back at the house, Claire and Emily sat on the park bench under the budding maples, a book spread open across their laps. Claire's arm encircled her daughter, her fingers playing absently with Emily's fine hair. Emily watched the water, a slight smile curving her mouth, her legs swinging, feet just grazing the soft moss beneath the bench. For a long time, neither spoke. The pages of the book fluttered in the gentle breeze, the story half read, the day half lived. Shadow and Sam returned slowly, following the path worn by repetition and trust. When the dog saw Emily, his pace quickened, tail waving. Emily hopped from the bench and ran to meet them, her steps sure and bright. She buried her face in Shadow's neck, her arms a brief circle of warmth. Sam met Claire's eyes. No need for words, just the silent gift of presence. He sat beside them, Claire shifting to make room, their shoulders touching lightly. The afternoon stretched, unhurried. They watched the sunlight play in the grass, listened to the gentle squabble of geese, and let the breeze carry away the last threads of winter. Sam thought of the months behind them, the nights of fear, the heavy silence, the relentless snow. He thought of wounds, seen and unseen, and of the ways they could mend, not by forgetting, but by daring to let someone else stay close. As evening fell, they wandered back toward the house. The porch lights flickered on, casting a soft glow onto the walk. Claire lingered in the kitchen, humming as she chopped vegetables for supper. Emily curled on the living room rug, her knees drawn up, pencil in hand as she sketched another picture of Shadow, a dog large and smiling, always in sunlight. Shadow sprawled beside her, half asleep, a living anchor. Sam sat on the porch, listening to the familiar sounds within, the scrape of chair legs, the faint laughter of a child, the low murmur of Claire's voice as she read from her book. He felt the ache in his chest, an ache made of hope this time, not absence. He realized that home, for him, was less a place than a feeling, a space held together by trust, ordinary kindness, and the courage to remain. Night settled quietly. They ate together, unhurried. Shadow was given his own slice of leftover roast, Emily giggling as he took it with gentle teeth. Claire lit a candle on the table, its light softening every face. Sam felt something loosen inside, some old fear or memory finally finding rest. After dinner, the house was filled with the easy silence of belonging. Sam cleared the dishes. Claire washed. Emily fed Shadow scraps beneath the table. The dog's eyes shone, content, as he followed Emily from room to room. When bedtime came, Claire tucked her daughter in with a story, her voice low and sure. Sam stood in the doorway, watching the rhythm of mother and child, his hand resting on the old frame. Later, as darkness pooled in the corners of the house and the last embers faded in the stove, Sam made one last round, checking locks, smoothing the blankets over Claire's shoulders, kneeling to scratch Shadow's ears. The dog looked up, tail thumping, and for a moment their eyes met. Two survivors, steady, changed. Sam stepped outside for a breath of air, the night cool against his face. He looked up at the stars scattered above the pines. Somewhere an owl called, answered by the hush of wind in the branches. He stood there a long time, simply breathing, feeling the weight of gratitude in his chest. Inside, Shadow curled at the foot of Emily's bed, her hand trailing in his fur. Her dreams quieter now. Claire's breathing was soft, steady in the next room. Sam lingered in the hall, watching the hush settle, and understood that what remained was not only survival, but a gentle, stubborn hope. No miracles had arrived, no grand gestures, only small choices, repeated, to stay, beside a stranger, beside a dog, beside fear, beside trust. That was how a family became possible. That was how warmth remained, even after the longest winter. And so, with the first hint of spring at the window and the safe, steady presence of Shadow curled close, the house held its peace. They had not become perfect. They had only become enough. When winter finally gave way to spring, what remained wasn't the memory of hardship, but the warmth left behind by simple acts of kindness. A hand reached out, a loyal dog resting by your side, a promise that no one is meant to face life's coldest moments alone. Sometimes it isn't grand gestures or perfect words that heal us, but quiet presence, gentle loyalty, and the courage to stay. If this story found its way to a quiet place in your heart, we'd love to know, what moment spoke to you most? Share your thoughts below, or a memory of a person or animal who brought you hope when you needed it most. Sometimes, a single comment is the start of someone else's healing. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, may kindness and gentle company find you wherever you are.